Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Annual Communicating Science Seminar. I'm so excited that you all are starting the AAAS annual meeting with us today. My name is Emily Cloyd. I'm the director of AAAS's Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. And I'm joined today by a few of my colleagues who will be around throughout the day to help you with any questions you have about the seminar, or other public engagement activities that are taking place throughout the meeting. So Alana Kimbrell, right there. Mary Catherine Longshore. And Jamima Philippe. I'm delighted that you all are here today, and I hope you are looking forward to the discussions of science communication and public engagement. I'm really excited this year because in addition to the panels that we have happening this morning, we are trying something new. We have breakout sessions and a networking fair this afternoon that feature topics suggested by many of you. We also have a couple of tables in the back, there and there. Some of our breakout session leaders and networking fair participants were going to bring some materials because you can't get to all of the sessions, so check out those tables throughout the day. There may be some things appearing there for you to look at. A couple other logistics. The bathrooms, if you have not found them yet, are out that door and sort of down the hallway, just a few steps. The Wi-Fi password is AAAS in DC, all lowercase. And there is also some water in the back. So if you get parched, we are gonna have discussion today, not just lecture. So there is some water if you need that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. How many of you have been to a communicating science seminar during a previous meeting? All right, how many of you are newbies? Awesome. So for those of you that are new to the Communicating Science Seminar, our panels today will explore some of the best practices and research related to science communication and public engagement. And when we talk about public engagement, we're really talking about intentional, meaningful interactions that provide opportunities for dialogue and mutual learning between scientists and a variety of public audiences. All right, so speaking of audiences, one of the things that's really important in public engagement is knowing your audience. So let's find out a little bit about all of you. How many of you are scientists or engineers? Okay. How many of you are already doing some sort of science communication or public engagement? Awesome. How many of you are practitioners who spend most of your time doing science communication or public engagement or training scientists to engage the public? Science journalists, educators, have a few of those, great. How many of you are researchers who are studying science communication and public engagement? All right, a few of you, excellent. How many of you are students and faculty, program staff, administrators, deans, department chairs, folks like that? Awesome. So it looks like we have a pretty good mix of participants today, and I encourage you all to talk with each other during our breaks and during lunch, during the breakout sessions, and to use social media during the sessions and afterwards to keep the conversation going. In addition to the 2 microphones we have around the room, so one in that aisle and one in that aisle, which you can use for questions during the discussion portion, you can also tweet to @_SciComm and use the hashtag AAASmeeting, MTG, to ask questions, and we will pass those along to the panel moderators. We'll also have a link for a survey about the seminar up on screen after each panel. So at the end of the day, we would really appreciate you taking a few minutes to give us some feedback about your experience during the Communicating Science Seminar. So with that, let's get started with our first panel. So I'll invite them to come up as I introduce them. So our first panel is Opportunities to Engage Policymakers. The moderator today will be Dan Barry. Dan is the Director of Local and State Advocacy, a new program launched by AAAS this past year in 2018. The Local and State Advocacy program will build, train, and equip cohorts of local and regional scientists to assert the role of science as a key to positive change. Prior to joining AAAS, Dan was the director of Eco-America's Path to Positive Communities program, where he worked with mayors and other local affected leaders and their key climate staff to develop and promote local community engagement efforts based on enhanced capacity and the deployment of positive, value-oriented communications. Dan.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, good morning. I want to invite Dr. Suhey up, Dr. Brady, and Dr. Alvaro Marosa. Please have a seat. Wonderful to be here. This is my first meeting at AAAS, and it's a wonderful crowd to see you all out here. Very encouraged by all the engagement that people have indicated they're already doing. If you think you're in the wrong room, you're not. Communications and engagement is critically important to our work, so I'm glad you'll be here for the program today. Emily and her team have really put a lot of work into this. They are experts in this field, so you're going to learn a lot. I'm going to learn a lot. This topic is communicating science and policy, and it's about opportunities for dialogue with policymakers. It's critically important in this day and age. And what we're going to do is explore effective strategies for conveying policy and evidence-based, relevant evidence-based communications with policymakers and others. There are others in our community who can benefit from our expertise. And we're going to talk about advocating for the role of evidence in the deliberative process. In my trainings, I talk about the arts and sciences of communications and engagement. The sciences are really the effective, proven methods for communicating and engaging. We've put a lot of work into this. There's research that supports it. The arts are what we personally bring to a conversation. We are representatives of our discipline, of our community, of our family. And so there's the personal element to that. And that's critically important to make sure that you deliver that you're having a conversation. This is really all about effective communications. And what our panelists are going to talk about will support all of that. And let me introduce them quickly, if I can get my notes here. Dr. Liz Suhey is with us. She's the Associate Professor of Government at American University in their School of Public Affairs. She specializes in U.S. public opinion, political psychology, and political communications. I've seen her speak, and it's dynamic, so really glad she's here. She's working on funding with funding from the National Academy of Science on the project Evidence-Based Communication with Policymakers in collaboration with AAAS. So we've been working with Dr. Suhey for quite some time. Next is Dr. Sarah Brady. She is the Interim Deputy Director at the California Council on Science and Technology, where she manages a large-scale project that talks about policy initiatives with the state legislature and state agencies. So their program is really all about regular communications with policymakers and decision makers on the state level in California. She leads the effort at CCST to connect a network of experts with the legislative bodies and the state agencies in California. And she'll be talking about delivering science to state leaders, lessons from the California State Capitol. California is a leader in this field. 10 years of experience, I think, at CCST doing this on the state level. So I think we'll gain a really great perspective from Dr. Brady. And last but not least, Dr. Jesus Alvaro Marosa. He's a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow right now. He's in a 2-year policy fellowship with the National Science Foundation. He is an ambassador with the Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network, where he mentors scientists in science policy and communications. And his talk is called Shut Up and Listen, the First Path of Communicating Science, which is my cue to introduce my first speaker, Dr. Suhey. Thank you very much.
It was open?
Yes, it was each had to open.
Aha. Okay, thank you. My colleagues were more organized than than I expected. I should have expected that from AAAS. So good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see so many people here. I'm going to be talking to you about communicating science with policymakers in a polarized environment. I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes. It's a big talk. It's a big topic. So we'll see how far we can get. I wanted to point out that we are focusing here on the U.S. Congress, just so you understand that focus, but we hope that our advice that we share is relevant to legislative environments elsewhere in the U.S. So this is a collaborative project that I've been working on for about 1.5 years with the wonderful Emily Cloyd and Aaron Heath of AAAS, as well as Aaron Nash, who's a philosopher of social science at the University of New South Wales in Australia. This is a project that was funded by the National Academy of Sciences, the Rita Allen Foundation, as part of a researcher practitioner grant, so explicitly focused on bringing researchers together with practitioners. The goal of the project is to provide advice to the scientific community regarding how to best communicate with policymakers. We wanted to make recommendations based on systematic evidence, and we have. And so you'll hear some of that today, and then at the end of the talk, I'll show you a web address where you can find our full recommended practices for engaging with policymakers. The reason why we did this project, and presumably the reason why we received funding, is because we perceive there to be a great need for advice on this topic. I don't think I need to convince anybody in this room that policymakers are quite important. They make our laws, in charge of overseeing agencies, and the scientific community is really interested in engaging with them, already is quite a bit, but what we discovered is that there is a dearth of research on the topic of best practices in engaging with policymakers. Okay, so what do we all want? We want evidence-based conclusions, right? One thing that I want to convey today is that evidence-based conclusions are important, but evidence is not the only thing that influences policy. We want evidence-influenced policy. And recognizing the array of influences on policy, some good and frankly some bad, will help you be a more effective science communicator when you're engaging with policymakers. So I want to walk through a simplified version of how we see the different influences on policy. I want to start by pointing out that policymakers, they have to make difficult decisions every day. The country, the world faces too many problems to solve all at once, and so there must be prioritization. And usually there's a reasonable set of possible policy solutions to any particular problem, and policymakers have to choose among them. As they go about prioritizing and choosing policy solutions, there are various legitimate things to take into account. I'll list evidence first here. So we have evidence on the magnitude of problems, evidence on what actions are most efficient. And I think that's what most people in the room are probably most comfortable with, is thinking about the importance of evidence. But there are also real questions as to whose interests should be prioritized, and also legitimate value differences as to how one should go about solving problems. So, for example, whether we should tackle a problem using the federal government or at the state level. Okay. So those are influences on policy that are pretty reasonable, but in this day and age, we know that there are lots of other influences on policy that are more controversial and more problematic. Political parties are a very real influence. Political scientists would say that political parties aren't bad in and of themselves, but probably play too large of a role in determining policymakers' votes. And that's a very real thing that we must grapple with. Ideology, I would say as well, not problematic in and of itself if we just think of ideology as value priorities, but of course we know that that these days ideology can run to extremes, keep people from compromising, color people's perceptions of the factual world. Finally, I'm not going to defend this influence, but it is true that our political context has grown more and more unequal, and we have greater and greater influence of affluent donors as well as corporate lobbyists, and that does tend to, it can freeze out the influence of nonpartisan experts as well as ordinary citizens. Okay. So that all sounded a little pessimistic. So what can you do about this? I don't want to stand here and argue that this is easy. Part of the reason we're doing what we're doing is that we know that this is difficult, and we hope that we can encourage more people, more scientists and science advocates to engage with policymakers and give them the tools to do so effectively. And so with that in mind, we are a little bit optimistic. So the first thing that you can do is learn more about government. This is a case where a little bit of study goes a long way. We've put together a resource for you. AAAS's other resources, a few hours can get you pretty far. You can also join with others who know more about government than you do. But understanding the ins and outs is really important for being effective. So the second thing that you can do is you can talk to a wide range of policymakers. We want to urge folks to not fall prey to polarization themselves, to not exaggerate the differences that lie between political parties. There are real opportunities for bipartisan cooperation out there. And as you go about talking to a diverse group of people, there are various things you can take advantage of to both gain access and gain people's trust. One of the things that is often not recognized is the importance of geography. So talking to your member of Congress or talking to a member of Congress from your state, even if they aren't in your political circle. Taking advantage of organizational and personal connections. This is a place where maybe we're talking about a friend of a friend, and that's something that I understand most of us don't know elected officials, but if we extend that to staff members, that becomes more possible. You should be creative as you think about making these connections. For example, sharing an alma mater with somebody is something that could help you gain access and gain somebody's trust. Topical connections as well are something that you should look for. I've heard all kinds of stories in talking with policymakers about specific topics that policymakers are really passionate about, from CRISPR to sea turtles, right? So ask around and find out if there are a handful of members of Congress, for example, who are really passionate about the topic that you study. So the third thing that is important to keep in mind is to be relevant to policymakers' goals. Policymakers are busy people. They are very goal-oriented. Frankly, part of that orientation is to get reelected. To get reelected, they have to take care of their constituents. So when you talk with policymakers, you always want to keep this in mind. It's okay to focus on what you want from the interaction, but you also need to remember that if they help you, they probably need to have some sort of, there probably needs to be some sort of shared goal there. Focusing on policymakers' committee work is another priority of theirs, where you can find common ground. And finally, of course, keeping in mind the importance of political parties. Policymakers are interested in pursuing priorities where they can get people from their party on board. So fourth is keep in mind that you can and probably should work with others. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So before you get going, you might talk to your government relations office and find out if there's already some sort of activity taking place around the topic that you care about. And if there isn't, of course, you can create your own. One thing we learned in talking with policymakers is that they are quite sensitive to numbers, so the bigger your coalition, the likelier it is that you'll have an impact. And finally, we really want to urge people to remember the long game. This is something that in order to move the ball in terms of getting more evidence into the policymaking process, it's going to take some time, it's going to take numbers. If you are able to be engaged and be persistent in your engagement, build relationships among policymakers, whether it's at the national government or at state level, that is the type of engagement that's most likely to be effective. So I want to make sure that I mention where you can find our recommended practices. So they're at this website, american.edu/SPA for the School of Public Affairs /SciComm. So you can find them there. Hopefully they'll be helpful to you. And hopefully you will continue to or start to engage with policymakers. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Suhey. As a reminder, we're going to go through the 3 presentations and take questions and have a discussion for about an hour at the end of this. So think of your questions, go ahead and tweet them to us, write them down. There are 2 microphones. Keep the program moving along. I'd like to invite Dr. Brady to come up and make her remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm happy to be here today. I am a chemist, but I also spent a handful of years working in the California State Capitol. So I work very squarely at the intersection of science and policy. So I'm going to give you a few examples today about how the California Council on Science and Technology and staff like myself are interacting with our state leaders. So to start, CCST is a boundary organization, and this is a really important concept. So we work directly with the producers of information, many of you, the scientific community, and we help bring that information to the users, the decision makers, or the public. But it also goes the other way as well. So we also facilitate getting questions from leaders and getting help from the scientific community in trying to answer those. So CCST, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were created 30 years ago. We just celebrated our 30th birthday by the state legislature. And so when they created CCST, what they were looking for was an easy way to access scientific advice for legislators, the governor, and other state agencies. So how do we do that? Well, 2 main methods are reports and expert briefings. So reports is when a legislator or the secretary of an agency will reach out to us and actually enter into contract with us to get a full peer-reviewed report on a subject anywhere from underground natural gas storage or trying to keep cell phones out of prisons, a whole wide variety of issues. And so we're able to figure out the scope of the problem and really put together an in-depth review of the existing scientific information on this subject and relate it to the policy questions that the leader had for us. A more efficient, a faster way to get information from the scientific community to decision makers are expert briefings. So we'll pull together a panel of experts on a particular issue, whether it's the spread of hepatitis A in different California cities last year, or the use of emerging technology to respond to wildfires and help evacuate neighborhoods. And so we work with the experts on the panel to really distill their message. What are their 3 main points that they want that audience to walk out of the room with? We kind of coordinate it, so each panelist has a specific area and we're covering the whole breadth of an issue. And we then open up the room to questions. And so the presentation part is actually very short because we want to create that opportunity for the staffers and the decision makers to directly ask questions to the scientists. CCST also puts together a 1-pager for these briefings. So this provides an overview of everything that was discussed at the briefing, and then includes the contact information for all of the scientists, so we can help facilitate follow-up that way. So how do we do this? When we get asked a question like that, we go out to our sustaining institutions. So we have formal partnerships with the University of California, the community colleges, California State University, Stanford, Caltech, and all of the federal laboratories in California. So we send out basically a call for expertise to this network. Somebody in that network either volunteers themselves or connects us with someone in their network. Beyond that, we also administer the CCST Science Fellows Program, which is based off of the AAAS Fellowship Program here in DC that many of you might be familiar with. So while CCST is 30 years old, our fellowship program just celebrated its 10th anniversary. So we place 10 PhD scientists in the state legislature every year so that staffers in the Capitol have immediate access to problem solving, an analytical way of looking at problems, and to somebody that can also tap into the network that CCST provides. So that's about CCST. So these are some main points that we found and that we try to really hit home with our scientists when we're working with them. And as Liz said, decision makers are working on a never-ending list of issues. And so the ability to deliver a concise and clear message to them is vital. It's hugely important. So as scientists at CCST, we really encourage our partners to go beyond their standard research slides and really focus on this face-to-face communication. And then again, what Liz said too is, every dialogue is different. And so you really need to find that shared common ground that Liz discussed. So I'm going to cover 3 opportunities for dialogue that all of you could engage in. And these offer different levels of time commitment, essentially. So there are brief opportunities, whether that's an email, a letter, or a meeting. There are moderate length opportunities, speaking on a panel like we're doing today, or being invited to participate in an information hearing. And then more long-term, building a relationship and a network with decision makers. And so CCST really helps facilitate all 3 of these. So to go into specifics, meeting with policymakers. It's an excellent opportunity to really get to know the motivation for this decision maker, whether it's the secretary of the California EPA or the senator that represents part of San Francisco. What we impress upon the people we work with, don't be upset if you meet with staff. You won't always get that meeting with the governor or with the secretary, right? Staff are vital. They are gatekeepers for these decision makers, and they're the ones that are going to pass your message on to the decision maker. So the next time you ask for a meeting, then maybe you'll get that meeting with the actual elected official. Liz already pointed out as well, are you a constituent? Is that a common ground? Can you talk about some local issues for this decision maker? Something that can be a little bit tricky is trying to answer the question of, are you advocating or are you providing advice? So at CCST, as a nonpartisan nonprofit, we provide advice. We bring in the science, we explain it, but we don't encourage a particular vote on a bill or a particular regulation. Whereas advocates, they come in support or opposition to an idea that the decision maker is working on. So it's important that when you're going into this meeting, you're pretty solid on what your motivation is in that meeting. And then prepare 1 to 3 main points. Make sure that at the end of the meeting, whoever you're meeting with can remember those 1 to 3 key things. Speak on a panel. So policymakers are always looking for experts and witnesses for legislative or regulatory hearings, briefings, or even events in the district. What's really important here is that you stay on message. When you get that invitation, they're going to explain to you why they invited you in particular, and they probably have other panelists that they're trying to balance your perspective with. So it's really vital to be respectful of your role there. And more often than not, these panels, briefings are open to the public. So always be prepared for the unexpected. Be calm and handle everything with grace that might happen in that briefing. And finally, relationship building. So CCST, our reputation and our independence, our nonpartisanship is our bread and butter, right? We have built a long-term relationship with decision makers in the state of California, and we help bring individual scientists into that relationship so that those scientists can become a trusted advisor. So on your left here, the man in the hat in the middle, he's a professor at UC Davis, and he's been working over years to build this type of relationship, and he's the go-to guy now for the Senate, for the state legislature, whenever they have questions about transportation, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, whatever it might be. And so we help to build that type of relationship. So in closing, I hope that you all want to take advantage of some of these opportunities. Understand the opportunity. Do you have 2 minutes to speak, or are you just going to answer questions? Know your audience so you can build that common ground, and always ask for advice. Boundary organizations like CCST, AAAS, we're always happy to help you guys connect. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and thank you for clarifying that CCST is 30 years old, not 10 years old. I mixed that up. The fellowship program is a model, though. It's really a wonderful project over 10 years that you've done. So, our last speaker is Dr. Jesus Alvelo Marosa. He's going to speak to us about some of his experience in Puerto Rico, but also, I think, hopefully through your fellowship program that you're doing with NAS. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. I want to do a small experience with the audience, and don't worry, that I work at NSF, so we don't need any funding for that. If it goes wrong, I won't show you to the autoclave as a microbiologist. I always like that. Sorry. Those in the audience, I want to know how many of you have engaged with policymakers. Let that be with Congress, staff in the state. All right, this is good. Now, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. How many of you, those that have engaged with policymaker, have engaged with the same policymaker 3 months afterward? Okay, that's not bad. All right, so the biggest mistake that I've seen in science policy is that people see the meeting between the scientist and staff member as a transaction, as a banking transaction, and that's not it. Sarah mentioned that actually it is a relationship, and that's actually key. Mostly staff member, we're busy. We have tons of projects, and sometimes we get shift around to do things. Sometimes we have to do data analytics, which is something that I do. Sometimes we have to meet with different scientists and get feedback from them. Then we have to go to a meeting, engage with a different topic, and then we have to go back to that data analytics. And then we forgot sometimes what we talk about with the scientists. So having that relationship, like sending that email, that text message, every 2-3 months, it's key. It's key to keep building that relationship, because sometimes that problem that we want to solve or you want to solve is not going to get solved at the moment. So that's the main key thing that I need to tell you. The other experience that I have experienced as a staff member is engaging with scientists is that sometimes, more than often, those that actually are faculty like to look down upon those that are staff members. They actually think that we're kind of like the underpaid postdoc. We're not, actually. We don't work in your lab, and you're not my boss, actually. So you need to tone it down quite a lot, actually. So that's the first advice that I will give you. You're actually coming to our sanctum, not me to your sanctum. So we are actually here to listen to your advice, but you need to make sure that we have a lot of problems that we need to solve, and the first thing that you actually need to do is actually shut up and listen and understand our problems first before you actually come in and think that you have all the solutions to our problem. So that's the other second main thing that you need to be aware of when you're engaging with a policymaker. I have friends that they work on Congress. Sometimes they hear the same story 10 times. Sometimes it goes very well. Tell them, if you already heard this, please let me know so I can help you and redirect you with something else. Congress members actually are quite busy. They have short spaces. Sometimes they need only will talk to you for 5-10 minutes. Maybe a staff member in the federal government actually going to engage with you with half an hour to an hour, depending on the topics. Probably you're not going to be the only person in the room. There's going to be 10, 15 other people in the room. Sometimes there's not going to be enough time for you to actually say what you want to say. So you have to be aware of that environment. Okay, so some key experience that I had in Puerto Rico when I was a science advisor for a governor candidate. I wasn't in Puerto Rico at that time. Me engaging with a governor candidate is actually quite different, particularly in a campaign. But also kind of similar. So campaigns, they're always fast-paced. Topics are always coming up every week or 2 topics every week. Sometimes when I want to talk about climate change, my candidate have to deal with, let's say, healthcare, for example. And so I need to wait in that, engage with the advisor that has to deal with healthcare and make sure that one pager is going when it needs to be. Or I need to actually wait during the night for my candidate because he already had to do 3 meetings and 2 conference presses that day. And then instead of giving that pager memo, I actually need to give him like a 10-minute summary by phone. So that's actually one of the things that happens a lot in public policy. Sometimes we want to give a lot of information, but given the shortage of times and urgent matters that probably are not what you're working for, it's quite difficult, and you need to be dynamic. And that is one of the true values that we have as scientists, that we're dynamic and we know how to solve problems. But before that, we need to understand the complexity that happens within those problems. Another experience that I have so far recently working with Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network that recently was created a couple of months ago is when I'm talking to the upcoming scientists and grad students that they want to engage with policymakers, is that do your research. When you sit down and read your papers before you go to the bench, you read 10, 20, 15 papers, and then you do some pilot experiments. The same thing applies when you're going to meet with your staff member. You do your research, read what's their experience, where they're working on, what is the topics that they have been working, what is the caucus that they're working on. And that way, when you go to that meeting, let's say that you're an engineer, but you're going to be working, let's say, in transportation and climate change. You need to be, and probably that is not what you're specialized. You're probably specialized in construction, but you do need to do a little bit more research, let's say, on gas emissions or electric power or phone call. That's not for me. But yeah, you need to be aware in this type of situations, and you probably need to go a little bit outside of your scope and your field, and that's actually quite good because it forces you to be out of your comfort zones. And most of the time when you're working in science policy, you will be out of your comfort zone. You have to deal with a lot of audience. Some people are very grumpy. They actually want to solve their problems like, you need to close down all the prisons and use that money for education. It's like, NSF doesn't do that, unfortunately. We actually give money, but I hope that we can actually do some reforms in prisons, but that's not our main task. So you're actually deviating the topic and wasting my time and the time of the other members from the audience instead of providing something more meaningful and direct in the talk. So I just want to keep it short and sweet. Just remind yourself to be aware of who you're going to be talking about. Build that relationship. Always send that email 2 or 3 times. I still have people that send me emails 2 or 3 times every 2 or 3 months. It feels really good. I do respond to my emails. I say, hey, thank you for keeping in touch. And it actually does matter, and it actually does make a huge difference. I have people come in and they invited me to go and give talk, and then they come in to Washington, D.C., and we sit down and chat. So building that relationship is key. Thank you.
How about a hand for all of our panelists? I want to thank them all for their comments. They weave together really nicely in supporting something that I like to remind people when they're thinking about engagement. Engagement is a journey, not a destination. And if you think about it from that perspective, then it allows you to create a map to go forward. It gives you permission to detour or take a pit stop. And the destination is always a little bit further away. So if you think that you're done doing engagement, you may have accomplished one goal, but there's always additional engagement. If we're going to be advocates, if we're going to be advisors in the realm of policy or with civic leaders, there's always more work we can do. So think of it as a journey with multiple destinations. Okay, so I'm sure people have a lot of questions. A reminder, there are microphones in both places over here. Are the mics on? Can somebody test a mic? Or there you go. Is it working?
Okay.
It's working. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, can I begin
Yes,
now?
go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I have one question for Liz. I'm a freelancer science journalist, while also studying science communication at Cornell. And so my question is, I think you have provided many techniques to communicating science to policymakers. But as you mentioned, right now the policy environment is highly ideologically polarized. And many politicians are highly motivated reasoning. So in this situation, how I think many techniques you identified, many of them are very regular techniques, such as leaguing with other people, or how this technique can overcome the very polarized thinking among politicians. You know, we have many evidence for that. Many politicians look at the cold day and they simply say, "It's a cold day, so there's no global warming." Yeah, thank you.
That's a great first question. So the first thing I want to say is every policymaker is different, including elected officials being different from staff members. I think it's important to not exaggerate the amount of ideological motivated reasoning or partisan conformity in the US Congress. So what happens is the places where there's sharp disagreement between Democrats and Republicans, those sharp disagreements tend to get more press coverage. And I would also say that sometimes the leaders themselves play into this because they want to appeal to their base in their communications. But if you actually interact with individuals, I think you would find that there's less of that than you may imagine for most. Again, everybody's different. And there definitely would be overall even less among staff members. There is a fair amount of bipartisan cooperation going on. I mean, you can go just look at bills that have been passed, but they tend to get less attention, right? So first of all, I would say just remember that there is real opportunity for bipartisanship. In terms of strategies that you can employ, I talked about some strategies for building trust. And so that includes, those geographic connections, potentially. That includes different types of personal connections, topical connections, et cetera. I also think that truly trying to, I'm a little cautious to use this word, but empathize with the policymaker to try to understand their perspective and show that you are trying to and hopefully getting there can help to build trust and maybe start to break down some of that resistance if there may be some. And then finally, and this is part of the empathy part, really remember what their goal orientation is. So constituents usually first, different ways of doing that. Even talking about an issue like climate change, you can do it in ways that aren't necessarily going to press people's motivated reasoning buttons. And the other points I made about thinking about ways in which you can present a topic that might be appealing to not only that individual but other members of the party. We are in a time when people do tend to, vote along lines of party lines. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, curiosity, empathy, gratitude, they work in our interpersonal relationships. They can work with policymakers too. Question over here.
Thank you very much for the 3 talks and for the introduction. My background is both natural science and social science, and I work across these domains, and specifically in the area in terms of trying to do transdisciplinary research with a whole set of people, both in the United States and many other places around the world. My question is, and this maybe pulls it over to the education, in a sense, why are we even, the expectation that as scientists, whatever flavor you'd like, should engage with policymakers or with the public more broadly. And my concern is that when we talk about transdisciplinary research, it's actually quite an effort to get scientists of any flavor, as I said, to begin to really listen to the stakeholders, rights holders, shareholders in the first place, so I fully agree with that, but also to understand how to do the background work to understand who they're talking to. And that's true, again, regardless of the country, regardless of the particular politics. But my concern is that in the educational trajectory, starting from early childhood all the way through lifelong learning, in a sense, we don't embed that in the expectation of what is it to do science. It's not there. So the sort of Enlightenment, narrow, reductionist science is absolutely necessary, but it's insufficient to deal with these kinds of complex problems. So I think it's also, everything you said here also applies, if you will, to the process of education. I would love to hear your thoughts about how one might do that more effectively. Thank you.
Got it?
Got it. It hasn't snapped. Great point. Actually, where I work at NSF is actually called Engineering Education and Centers. And I work in 2 programs. One of them is engineering education, and the other one is engineering research and center, which is the largest engineering grant program of all the United States. And one of the areas that we have funded, NSF has funded, particularly in education, has to do with K-12 education, and in that intersection between sociology, psychology, economists. And most of that has to do to try to understand the social problem, the identity problems on the students, and some of those research that have been funded, they have to do with communication. You know, one of the biggest problems that we actually have as scientists is sometimes we don't even sit down and talk about ourselves. And the other thing is that, you know, scientists are always quite busy. They have to teach, they have to research, they have to sit down and write papers. And every university has their own mandates for those researchers. So sometimes telling them to engage in science, in science policy, in science communication is actually quite difficult. My advice is, if there is a science policy group in your university, engage with that more than often. Universities do have offices that they engage with policymakers. Sometimes trying to talking with them will be the first step, I would say. If there's not some students actually have science policy groups, maybe trying to engage with them or be a mentor with them or work with them or actually create a faculty group in science policy. I went to a site visit once at Arizona State University. I spoke with 2 students after that, and then she's actually one of those students who's one of them. Actually, we keep a constant relationship, and she told me that now they actually have a science policy group in ASU, and they actually have been engaging with local stakeholders in less than a year. So it's quite easy. Sometimes you just need that push and that spark, but as I understand from the perspective as a scientist that it's quite difficult given the workload that you have and the current funding mechanism and the all the complex apparatus that goes beyond that. And on the K-12 education, that's another monster, because trying to standardize the K-12 education in this country is quite difficult given how the laws are. So I hope I answered your question.
I'll add on very briefly. It's been really interesting, I think, over the last 5-ish years, seeing a huge increase in the number of science policy organizations that are led by undergrads or grad students, often in the sciences. So that's been really heartening that kind of early in their career they're thinking about that. And then I'll just put in a plug for boundary organizations because, you know, recently I was trying to convince this engineer to moderate a panel, an expert briefing for us. We did all the background work, we wrote his talking points, we briefed him on all the panelists, you know, we made it so, in his words, he couldn't say no. We just made it so easy for him to succeed at it. So.
And I just want to add one comment based on what you said about the explosion and the increase of science policy groups among younger scientists. In my professional background, I ran an opposition research group that monitored the anti-environmental, anti-regulatory political movement. They were the ones who crafted the 2.5-decade-long campaign against science in policymaking and in culture. And so it's not surprising that young scientists today are realizing that the marginalization of science and scientists has had a very dire set of consequences in policymaking and in cultural awareness of the importance of science. So it's a refreshing pendulum swing that I think we're experiencing. Okay, we'll go over here for a question.
Hi, my name is Kayla Miles. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cincinnati. You spoke, or the first speaker spoke about evidence-based conclusions as well as evidence-influenced policy. How do you push forward policy if the decision maker or policy maker that you're trying to convince doesn't even believe in evidence?
Do you have a specific example in mind, or is that just more general?
I'm pretty sure we've seen examples at the local, state, and federal.
So, as part of our research project, I interviewed over 40 members of Congress and staff members, about half and half. And it wasn't a representative sample, but I asked people not only about their approach to evidence, but also to kind of reflect on others. And so, at least when it comes to the US Congress, my impression from the study and just from research others have done, that most members of the US Congress are respectful of evidence generally. And that doesn't mean, and that's part of the reason I differentiated between the direct line from evidence to policy and something that's maybe more evidence influenced, is I think what happens today, and there've been actually a lot of really great editorials written along these lines, what happens today I think is that people recognize the importance of evidence on the Hill, but there are so many other influences that just push it down in terms of its relevance, and that's unfortunate. So, but I don't want to go beyond the study that we've done, which focused on the U.S. Congress, but I do think that as you get to state and local policymakers, there's a lot more variation in terms of the policymaking process, and you might get some instances. I think you may get more instances of people who are not as respectful of evidence in the policymaking process. I hope that's helpful. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what to do about it, I mean, there are some people who are just lost causes, and I think it's important to prioritize. I mean, we only have so much time. But I was at a workshop recently, and somebody was telling me about an interaction with a scientist who specialized in Alzheimer's was telling me about an interaction with a state legislator, and the first meeting was absolutely disastrous, and the legislator was saying things based on personal experience that were completely upside down. But interestingly, the scientist kept at it and kept to school, and he was asked back for a second meeting, and that time, it went better. So, I guess I'm an optimist at heart, so keep at it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? It's interesting, one of the first rules of good communications is know your audience, and probably a good secondary rule is don't be afraid to engage in a little bit of triage. Work where you can actually have effect. Okay, we'll go back over here for another question.
Well, thank you very much for your presentations and your advice. I especially took away the part about relationships and building those relationships. I'm a faculty member at Notre Dame. My name is Jennifer Tank, and but I'm also serving as the current president of the Society for Freshwater Science. And so my question has to do with the role of scientific societies and the letters that we write that turn out to be a big part of a leadership role. And we also belong to a consortium of aquatic science societies. And I was wondering, in terms of specific policy recommendations, if sending letters on behalf of a consortium where you can claim 5 times as many members, sending it as president of a society and representing just your constituency, urging your society members to send individual letters. I mean, do letters count? And what is the best strategy besides just saying everyone should write letters all the time? With limited bandwidth, I want to know what the most effective advice would be. So thanks for that.
Yeah, before I was at CCST, I worked for an assemblywoman, and some letters matter and some letters don't, just to be perfectly honest, because we get so many. And when you're in the busiest time of the legislative session, it's impossible to read them all. So letters that come from a bigger number of people definitely carry more weight. From my, personal experience, and also from organizations that the member that you're writing to, or the secretary or whomever you're writing to, that they're familiar with. So I think that's where coupling letters with regular lobby days is really important, because that gets to the relationship building as well. And then, as Jesus said, sending the letter is just that extra additional reminder, 2 to 3 months later. Yeah.
One of the things that I asked about when I was interviewing folks on the Hill was how useful consensus documents were and that sort of thing. And it sounds like the letter from the consortium was something along those lines. So I just wanted to quick indicate that a letter from a large group communicating shared priorities is often very persuasive.
Just a quick programming note, technical difficulties. I have a Google Doc here getting the tweeted questions, and it's not refreshing. So we're going to work on that so we can get to the questions that people are tweeting to us. Meanwhile, we'll go back to the microphone and we'll solve this momentarily. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Zach. I'm from the University of Maryland. You laid out some really interesting strategies and some great stories about how scientists engage in kind of the normal deliberative legislative process. But I think increasingly in the last couple of years, we've seen times when politics kind of overflows or starts going very fast for a little while, whether it's like work stoppages during the shutdown or teacher strikes on the state level. The sunrise protests at the House building a couple months ago, it really pushed climate change to the fore, at least temporarily. And so I'm curious as to what the role of scientists can be and how we can engage in these moments when politics kind of isn't flowing down the normal deliberative channels, and what the best way for us to engage with those moments is.
Yeah, got it. Cool. Stick to the facts. And facts don't care about your feeling, but sometimes feelings don't care about the facts. And that's one of the challenges that you have to face when you're engaging with some specific policy members. So you have to understand that in politics, that policymaker, let's say, particularly in Congress, they have an audience that they represent, and they appeal mostly to the sentimental or some specific problem within their district. So keeping to the data and doing your research of what are the main interests in that person is not the same. You're probably not going to engage with a policymaker in Florida regarding salmon, but probably those in Alaska are interested in that, and you can actually talk about water security to the folks in Alaska when you're probably doing research in salmon. And that way you can actually bring in climate change quietly under the radar. So it's like finding their main interest or main economic source or their interest is always trying to find that, money talks, and there's always powers, economic powers in their district or in DC, and you have to try to make that connection. I'm assuming in the topics of climate change, like how is this going to affect positively or negatively in this area, and you need to focus on that, and you put that under the radar. Sometimes when we're making the case in renewable energy, you can say, well, this is actually a new job sector. It's going to create new jobs. It's going to make energy cheaper. And that way, and then you don't even bring the topic about climate change, but you're helping reduce the CO2 emissions and you're working climate change. So kind of like some of the strategies that you need to have in mind. And having emotional intelligence is important to keep very cool, very calm. You'll be surprised sometimes you're gonna meet somebody from opposite to your views that they're actually quite calm and relaxed, and sometimes you're gonna meet folks that believe in your views that they're not quite calm, and it's quite the opposite. So that might take you outside from your comfort zone. So you need to be very calm, very open to listening to their problems, like I said, and that way trying to connect your research or that problem that you want to bring to their problems.
So just, addressing the issue, I think partly you're getting at a notion of protest, something along those lines.
Yeah,
So,
well, how do scientists engage in those kind of moments when things are bubbling over?
so first of all, a caveat, I'm not sure there is a right answer to this, but political scientists have studied things like the March for Science, and there's some evidence that that those kinds of that those highly publicized actions by scientists as a group of scientists can risk politicizing science. I'm pro March for Science, but there's a risk. And so I think that it's, when scientists are acting as a group of scientists, I think that there needs to be a lot of caution about not opening oneself up to politicization or being too associated with one political party or the other. That said, scientists as citizens, should go out there and do whatever the heck they think needs to be done, right? So putting on different hats, trying to make sure others know which hat you're wearing, I think is important.
Okay, we are in touch with the Twitterverse, so we have some questions that have been tweeted from the audience. Kathleen Carroll asks, or makes the observation that the timeline for research often does not equal the timeline for policy. They're not the same. How do you make recommendations for policymakers that want science-based evidence for decision-making when your results indicate that you need further research, you need more information? It's an excellent question. Thank you.
We struggle with that a lot when we're doing our peer-reviewed reports, because the last thing we want to do is say, ask us to do another study. And so it's all about how you frame it, and I think that you can't just say do another study, but you can lay out the context of the very specific questions that still need to be answered, and that in the policy realm is still really new, really important information to have. And so it's really just about how you frame it. Do you want to add?
Can I dig a little deeper and ask you to, something that I've observed is that again, part of the campaign against science has been that science can't make up its mind. It's always changing, as if that's a bad thing, right? So is that something that part of your advocacy will address? That, in fact, that's the purpose of science, is to continually question assumptions and results and to dig deeper, and that's a good thing. That's why we're here to help you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think that we don't make policy recommendations. Mm-hmm. So we lay out the science and we connect it to the policy, but because the science might change, we're not going to say the new law should be this. But we can help them avoid putting specific numbers sometimes in regulation by discussing with them how and when those numbers might change. And so can you write the regulation with some sort of definition or trigger that requires revision to help in that instance, science and policy kind of develop together at the same time. But it all goes back to relationship building. So they have to trust you, and you have to be able to clearly explain to them and get their buy-in for why they shouldn't just put some arbitrary number in statute, for example. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we'll go back to this mic over here. You've been standing for 25 minutes, I think, so I'm glad you got to the mic.
Yeah. So thanks for speaking. My name is Megan Stark. I'm a genetics PhD candidate, and this question is kind of specific for you, Dr. Brady. I'm from a state or a region that has not historically prioritized science initiatives within policy, and to my knowledge does not have an organization that mirrors the CCST. So I guess my question is, I did a little snooping online, and you seem like a pretty sizable group now with, of course, the Fellows Program, and my assumption is that you did not start that way. So what are the origins of the CCST? Because there's a desperate need for that in my home state, and to my knowledge, there's no one working on forming it, so maybe that should be me.
Please do. Yeah, I may live in California now, but I also grew up, and all my family is still in an area where science is not particularly valued. So CCST started incredibly small. We didn't even have an office in Sacramento. It was in Riverside, California. The academics thought it was a bad idea to bring the organization too close to the politics. So that was kind of the original tension that they were dealing with when CCST was created. For us, what changed the game was the Science Fellows, our Science Fellows program, because you can talk and talk and talk, but for many decision makers and staffers, until they meet a scientist and can chat with you and realize you are a real person who cares about things in your lab and outside of your lab, they don't really buy in. So for CCST, I think our single most successful thing was the fellows, and everything else we do has been more in demand and more successful, I would say, since the fellows. So the good news is that CCST actually has a grant where we're helping to facilitate replication of the state level Science Fellows program in 11 other states. And so we're sharing everything we've learned about how can you get a fellows program up and running. We have a booth, is that what you're trying? Oh, there's a panel on Sunday at 1:30 about that. But for us, that really broke down the barriers. So I don't know if that
helps.
That helps.
Thank you. I'm just gonna. You'll likely be getting an email from me. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and hopefully Teddy 1387, that answers your question. Teddy asked the same exact question: how do we replicate CCST in our state? And so, Sarah, thank you for that. You know, fellowships are really an important way to get established, and they certainly provide value to policymakers and other civic leaders who are interested in science. So,
and I'll just add really quick, I think a key piece for success there is partnership with an academic institution. So CCST is able to do what we do because of the University of California, CSU, the community colleges, Stanford, and those partnerships. So that's a good way to start as well, as building those partnerships.
And just one comment, one of the states that you're working with, New Jersey, has gotten quite far along in establishing their state policy fellowship program, and will be conducting, I believe, a 2-week training session coming up in the next couple of months, where they're going to put their policy fellows through a very, very rigorous training. This is where it really matters, that we get the kind of communications and advocacy and engagement training, as well as the other training that they're going to do. So there is a lot of rigor going into this program from what I've gathered in my few short months at AAAS. Okay, we'll go back to this mic over here.
Hi, thanks for you all for the panel, for your work, and I would say also thanks to everybody who's in the room. I'm Katie from the University of Florida. I I'm wondering what you think the effectiveness is, or if you've looked at all into working with groups that are either grooming candidates or individual people getting into the candidate stage, and whether that's a good use of time given the other policymakers may be really busy and may be already talking to a bunch of people.
Definitely do it. I was invited by members from the governor candidate in 2016 in Puerto Rico. They're the one that approached me because they needed help, and I had a blast. I actually enjoyed working as a science advisor for my candidate more than I did my postdoc. And I was not getting paid being a science advisor. So you will learn a lot of how actually politics work, and actually being on a campaign it's quite special in the sense you will learn very quickly how the news games work, why are you doing the press conference when you are doing them. You will learn actually when do you need to engage specifically to your candidate on certain topics area. You will learn how you will manage your times, and sometimes when you decided to write a 5-page memo, you realize, you know what, I actually need to do a 1-pager because my candidate is quite tired. And so those are one of the things that you're gonna be working. So my advice is definitely work with that. You're gonna have a blast, whether, hopefully your candidate will win. But if it doesn't win, still it's a great experience because it's gonna give you a great perspective. But a lot of people actually don't have not that many scientists engaged with candidates, I believe. And having that on your resume and your experience is just amazing. So my advice is go for it, enjoy it, and just savor it.
It also gives you street cred with the decision makers you're trying to work with, honestly.
So, and just I would say, and don't forget about staff members. And maybe you yourself considering being a fellow or being a staff member, being a committee staff on Capitol Hill strikes me as a really cool job. And you can have a ton of influence. Personal staff as well. People are talking, for example, about this thing called the Green New Deal, right? Introduced by AOC, but it originally is, I'm sorry to take some of the luster away from her, I'm pretty sure it came from a staff member, and I'm pretty sure it got to that staff member from an expert. So don't forget about the importance of staff.
Over here at the mic.
Yes, thank you. Let me start by thanking Emily and her staff for putting this session together, and of course the panel for this. My name is Jerry Miller, and I'm a recovering scientist who had the privilege of working 4 years at the White House in a policymaking role. And after I left that position, I created a small consulting practice that I call Science for Decisions. So everything that we're talking about here this morning really resonates with me. But I have one suggestion and a question for the panel. The suggestion is that as those of us all around the country who think about engaging with our policymakers, and in particular those in Sacramento or those here in DC, realizing that not everyone who has a good idea that could be transmitted can spend very much time in Washington or in a state capital. I'd like to suggest that, that individuals try to network with like-minded people who do live in the capitals. For instance, I was on the Hill just last week, had a chance to speak after a hearing with the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, and I suggested to him a couple of individuals that he and his staff and his committee should hear from. So, but of course I could only suggest the people that I know. And there are lots of people like me around town here, so take advantage of us. Make us part of your network as you think about getting the results of your science into the policymaking realm. The question I have for the panel is the following. We know that there's a lot of talent, not only in our universities, but in the private sector. But focusing specifically on the universities, how do we get our administrators to not only encourage, but in fact reward the time that faculty could spend engaging in the policymaking realm? How do we make it count in the tenure decision process? How do we open the aperture for individuals to actually bring their science to the policymaking realm. I see this as a huge roadblock. And it's part of the kind of sociology of how universities operate. And I personally think that needs to change. But how do we change it? How do we get on with improving that particular situation?
That's a great question. As a fellow working at NSF that has been involved in seeing some grant solicitation more often than time in the broader impact, scientists do need to communicate their research and their findings. One way that scientists can work on that way is to actually say, besides publishing on a journal, a nice op-ed on your probably school newspaper or a radio talk or a TV interview, it looks good, and that way you can actually disseminate your work and actually engage, tell your university, with their social media team, I'm gonna go and do this and try to engage, and that way the researcher, the research, and the university can get more exposure. Opa. Aliens. Going back to that topic, definitely try to talk to the administrators, the value of science communication. Some of them, I'm assuming they're going to be open. Most of them probably not, given how social media is nowadays. You probably need to talk to, create a plan of what to say and how to say it, depending on or how you're going to disseminate your areas of research. But I'm seeing more and more actually PIs engaging in science policy and trying to, they're having interesting conversations with the administration in the universities, and that's also part of some of the initiatives that NSF does with some universities when we bring some of the faculties or administrators to NSF for us to receive feedback on some of the solicitations that we get, and sometimes we ask, so what about communication? So that's one area that might work.
So I agree this is really important, and we did a survey we got over 600 responses from AAAS scientist members, and this came up a lot as to why people weren't engaging. It was effectively the tenure process in universities, if they're at a university. So just a quick thing that I would note is that universities tend to really they tend to have a model of faculty governance, and so this ultimately comes down to the faculty. There's a difference where younger faculty members tend to be more interested in outreach to the public, to policymakers. So I would actually throw this to people actually at universities who are on the faculty. I know this is hard if you're pre-tenure, obviously. You may not feel like you can speak up about this, but anyway, more and more voices just talking about the societal importance of this, and it obviously helps if funders are encouraging it. So maybe these two things can come together to create some change.
Okay, we're approaching the end of our hour and a half, so I'm going to, as the moderator, give everyone notice we're in the lightning round, so let's make our questions very, very concise and our answers concise. There are a bunch of people that we want to get questions from. I am going to go back to Twitter, though, just because we encourage people to use that. And also, this is the greatest Twitter handle ever. Rama Adhikar, she's at Eat Sleep Sci, which is great, wants a little more information on how, as a PhD candidate, to aggressively talk about science in policymaking without and avoid the partisan pitfalls. So I know we've talked a little bit about that, but it bears repeating, I think, at this time. How do we navigate that?
You could talk about an issue from multiple perspectives, and I think that helps avoid that pitfall. So climate change, for example, you can talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but you can also talk about creating jobs in renewable technology, right? And so there are different ways to really promote the same policy.
Another tip that I've used in the past is when you're having a conversation, acknowledge ambivalence. Allow people not to be fully informed so that they feel welcome in the conversation. If we come into a conversation with all the answers and present ourselves that way, oftentimes it excludes people. They feel that they don't really have a role in the conversation. So that's helpful as well. Go over here.
Good morning. I'm Ben Tannenbaum, Sandia National Laboratories. I'm manager of government relations. Earlier on, I was an American Physical Society fellow up in Congress. So reacting to the question earlier about whether or not you should email, please don't, because it's emails, phone calls, and in-person meetings as far as the weight given to the office. Since email is so easy to do, it's kind of noise in the system, and there's nothing quite like a personal relationship. So Sandia is a federally funded research and development corporation. It is against the law for me to lobby. Likewise, those of you who receive federal grants, it's against the law for you to use your grant money to come by and lobby, but you can educate. So my question for the panel is, can you draw a bright line between lobbying and education?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the question of advocacy versus advice. So you certainly aren't going to, if you can't advocate, if you can't lobby, you're not going to take a position, support or oppose on a bill, on a regulation, but you can certainly talk about, you know, how hepatitis A is spread and how to stop it, which might be related to legislation that's going through. So.
I'm not a lawyer, so here's my legal advice. The bright line that I've been told is you can't advocate for or against named or numbered legislation. Yeah. And certainly you can't advocate for or against a political party or candidate. So, you know, I think that supports what you're saying when you're talking about the issues that are directly referred to in legislation without advocating for or against that legislation. You're getting close to the line, but that's probably acceptable. Are you an attorney? All right, any attorneys can correct me. So I tend to be aggressive. Oh, go over to this mic.
Yeah, hi, I'm Debbie Stein, and I'm the one moderating the session on Sunday about state fellowship programs. One thing we've been working on this, a whole group of us, for about 3 years. And one thing, piece of advice, besides obviously coming to the session, is that every state is different, and that there's lots of models, and what can be done in California does not necessarily work in my home state of Pennsylvania. So, you know, also try to make sure, like, what else is happening in your state. Because I find, like, I remember connecting 2 people from 2 Colorado universities together who didn't know what was happening within the state of Colorado. So I think if you're interested in doing something within your state, you know, please, you know, check, you know, with me or other folks about, is there something already happening in your state? So you can become part of that group, because sometimes it's a student group, sometimes it's a university, sometimes it's an Academy of Science. So there's no common denominator. Every member of a political party, you know, every political assembly is different, right? Every politician is different. And so I encourage you to kind of do that. We're also going to have like a fact sheet that, for example, will give you links to the documents CCST put together of the lessons they learned. So there's also a lot of practical lessons, and you'll hear about some of the programs that sort of have been started as part of this effort that was initially funded by the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, the Simons Foundation. I'd also like to do one more advertisement, as I myself am doing a flash talk on Sunday morning. I worked on both Capitol Hill and in the White House as to what the primary challenge I see is between advocacy versus analysis. And so what this is going to talk about is you know, what should you have beyond what most scientists do, which is effectiveness. There's other things that policymakers think about, and the idea is for you to understand what those are, and then as a result be more effective, you know, with what you're trying to do.
Thank you. One more from Twitter. Kaylee Steen asks, engaging with policymakers, how do we best use social media to facilitate engagement? Which I think is obviously a very critical question. I'm curious to learn about this myself.
So, unfortunately, when I was interviewing policymakers, I didn't directly ask about social media. So I'm guessing that the question is specifically about engaging with policymakers. You know, our general view is that engaging with policymakers is not something that's best done over social media. You know, tags or what have you, debates. It's something that might get some notice from an office. Offices keep general track of trends in support or criticism, but that's probably not the best venue. On the other hand, social media for engaging with the public is probably something that is much more worthwhile. So, yeah.
A small thing you can do though is if you have a meeting with a decision maker, feel free to tweet and tag them after. Thanks for the great meeting. We love discussing, you know, solar energy with you or whatever it may be.
So in my experience, engaging with policymakers in Puerto Rico, that social media does work. Probably not in the federal level, but probably in the state level that might work. And there was one time that before I joined AAAS, that there was a legislation bill in Puerto Rico regarding legalizing marijuana for research. And I wanted to contact the congressperson, and I did. I sent him a tweet, and he said, well, this is the phone number of my staff office, please call. And I did, and we had a couple of conversations. And how I also engaged with the governor candidate back then when he was the head of State Department in Puerto Rico was through social media. So don't disregard it, and it's particularly with local policymakers, I think it's a great way to engage with them.
Yesterday, my colleague Sean observed that when he worked in Congress, out of a typical 10-person staff, one person was the press secretary. Today, there are 3 or 4 people who deal with press and media in a typical congressional office. I'm not sure that is applies on the state level, but I found that an interesting observation. Yes.
Hi, my name is Danielle DeCrema. I'm from the University of Virginia, and I was wondering if you had any specific advice for engaging with a policymaker who is traditionally less receptive to scientific ideas. My representative is a member of the Freedom Caucus. I'm not going to be able to change his mind, but I still want to engage in a conversation with him. Thank you.
Yeah, I would recommend doing whatever background research you can on that member. What committees are they on? What issues are in front of them? And that allows you to bring up information about a particular issue in a way that you can frame it as, just in case it's helpful to you, we know you're going to have to think about this issue, and we just wanted you to have this, 3 bullet points that really lays out some important points. And then I would also think about if there's a local issue that you both do agree on, and you could start with that.
Okay, back over to this left mic.
Hi, my name is Alex Denker. I'm a doctoral candidate at Emory University. Many of the policy fellowships, such as those administered by AAAS, require that one has to have their PhD conferred before you can apply. I entered my PhD program with the intention of going into science policy, which is typically bizarre for someone pursuing a degree in academia. So my question is, what are some of the avenues that you think are some of the best ways of entering the science policy world that don't involve a fellowship? And also, sort of reciprocally, what do you think some of the best avenues that the policy world sees as some of the best ways to enter policy?
First of all, it is not bizarre to pursue policy after PhD, so we need to start normalizing that. And the second of all, it's quite easy. While I was a graduate student, I was writing op-eds in newspapers in Puerto Rico, and sometimes when I go there, I was invited to radio talks and had a chance to talk to other policy members regarding some topics. So simple things like that, writing an op-ed, participating in radio talks, being in meetings like this where you can do networking, are a great way for you to get yourself ready into science policy. Now, you don't necessarily need to be in a pardon me, in a science policy group in order to do science policy. There are jobs that they open oftentimes in science agencies that you could apply directly after your PhD or during your PhD and just go into and do science policy. So science policy is more than Congress. I'm realizing, given the audience, that everybody thinks policy making is only Congress. It's not. There's a lot of the policy that happens within the federal agencies, decision makings and feedback that we get, and we actually draft papers and memos and the decisions that we make. So that's another way that you have to see it, that policy making is not only Congress. So start early, start soon. Don't be afraid to write op-ed. It doesn't have to be in the New York Times. You local newspaper, they work wonder, and actually a lot of staff members from the congressperson, they actually go to that newspaper because that's the one from their district. And so make sure that you're trying to write something regarding a specific topic that might be on a national level, but also specific within that region. And maybe you can send that email to a staff member to the person, hey, I wrote about this problem that you're trying to solve, and I'd be happy to chat. And having that email exchange or that phone call, it's just great. So.
The CCST fellowship, you don't actually have to finish your degree before you apply, so that's an important difference there. You do have to finish it by September 1st. And then there are really some great opportunities for you to practice communicating with decision makers that might help you build a network that could avoid a fellowship or skip a fellowship is maybe a more positive way to say that. I loved my fellowship, for the record. CCST, we host, it's become an annual event, a Science Translator Showcase. And so we bring grad students and postdocs to the state capitol to talk in a really informal networking setting to staff members, agencies, and elected officials about their research. And so you walk away from that with business cards from people that are actually interested in the research that you're doing. And then I'll just add, as a staffer, there were many late nights when I was in the Capitol, no advocates around, no lobbyists, and I'm just trying to work on this bill, right? And I go to Google, and a lot of times, once I wasn't in academia, I couldn't get to the research I needed because it was behind a paywall. And so as a grad student, anything you can do to help share your results, op-eds or otherwise, maybe it's on your research group's website, in a way that's more accessible, that then gives me contact information that I can then chat with you to follow up about that is really useful.
So one quick thing I'd add is that the political arena is a very networky kind of place, as was just suggested, and so building a network is important. I would also say that policymakers probably would be more interested in you if you have some type of experience outside of academia actually within that arena. Don't be afraid to try to have an internship. Maybe you would work on a campaign just as a volunteer. Maybe when you actually get ready for that first job, maybe it's not your dream job. It's something in a personal office, maybe kind of low on the totem pole, but the way these things work, people do move around and move up pretty rapidly.
And your influence as a scientist is amplified by your influence as a constituent. It's fine to just be a constituent sometimes. Okay, we are at time. I'm going to click to this slide so that you can all type in the tiny URL and give us your feedback. We have time for one more question, which is perfect because we have one more question. So we'll go to you, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Thank you. I just want to say that I've really found this panel to be very helpful. I'm Kathleen Heide, professor of criminology at the University of South Florida. My area is youth violence, particularly homicide. So I just wanted to ask what I see to be an insurmountable problem. I took from here that what we want to do with politicians, particularly in policy, is to have evidence-based research, which we certainly do have in terms of gun control. That we want to make sure that it's that the politicians have constituents who believe in the issue, and we know that Americans in this country, the overwhelming majority are in favor of some kind of gun control. And the reality is, though, even when we have major incidents like Parkland and Newtown, and we all know them, that bring this issue right to the forefront, that the legislature refuses to pass any kind of meaningful gun control, any kind at all. And we know, and this is public information, I'm not telling anything you don't know, is that the NRA funds many of the politicians to millions of dollars. In fact, it's the rare politician, or let's say the minority, that take no NRA money. So I'm asking the panelists, do you have any suggestions what to do in this area, which seems to be insurmountable as we look at the history of Congress over many years?
So I think that there's a bigger issue at play here, which is that we have a problem with well-financed interest groups who have too much power in general, both at the federal level and the state level. And so part of this is just a political problem. We need political reform in this country. And that's, if we can have a more level playing field for lots of different voices, then I don't think we would see this kind of problem, and other problems would be solved as well. With respect to this specifically, it's really thorny because you can see that that public opinion is behind, reform in this area, but the NRA is very powerful. We may see that power wane going forward for various reasons, but I think that this is an area where the only thing I have at this moment is to step up engagement by experts. There is there's been some recent work that's found that members of Congress actually don't understand the public opinion in their district as well as they could, because their information environment immediately around them is not filled with their constituents. It's actually filled, mainly with lobbyists, and so actually, so engaging not only about the policy reform, but also keeping members informed about what opinion actually is in their district could be helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to work on the state level as well, right? Slowly but surely, you can increase regulations on certain issues in states that can then serve as a model to be adopted eventually federally.
I want to echo Sarah's words. Definitely start working small from the state level, and don't go by yourself. Try to do it by a group. It's actually more powerful when there's 5, 6, 10 people trying to engage with multiple state legislators at the same time, or trying to meet with the governor. It's way more powerful, and definitely preparing beforehand, and maybe having one lobbyist helping you how to guide what to say, how to say it, it goes wonders. So that would be my advice.
Thank you again to Liz, Sarah, and Jesus and Dan for that great discussion. A round of applause. We encourage you to continue that discussion during the break and online, again, using the hashtag AAASMTG. Before we break, I wanted to highlight a few additional opportunities during the AAAS meeting to learn about and practice science communication and public engagement. Tomorrow, public engagement staff will be on the expo stage at 1 p.m. for an interactive conversation about all the ways that people sci-engage. After that, join our coaches in the AAAS Lounge from 1:30 to 3 to make your own public engagement plan. On Saturday and Sunday, stop by Family Science Days to see public engagement in action. And on Saturday evening, join us for the public engagement networking reception from 6:30 to 8. More information about each of these activities and many others happening during the meeting will be scrolling during the break. So I will see you back here at 11 for our next panel.